afternoon, everybody. So what I'll be talking about today is a project that was done as part of the Models for Change initiative, the legacy phase of that initiative, actually. And start just with defining what we mean by adolescent domestic battery. So this is a term that's generally used to encompass family crisis or violence that results in police contact and possible delinquency system involvement for a young person. National estimates indicate that about 7 to 13% of all juvenile arrests are for alleged violence on a parent or caregiver. However, it's very hard to come up with a concrete number for the amount of arrests that are occurring for this reason. And that's because domestic battery is the official charge that's used the most often for juveniles, but sometimes there's other charges that are given instead, and those would be things like criminal damage to property or aggravated assault without any indication that it was a domestic incident, disorderly conduct, and so on. So it's actually very difficult to estimate the occurrence of this, of adolescent domestic battery. This work that I'll be presenting to you really stemmed from the efforts of a consortium of 3 counties in Illinois who are part of the Models for Change initiative. And they set forth to develop and implement improved system responses to youth who were involved in domestic conflict and their families. And the reason that they went on this mission, went down this path, is because they looked at their data. Shannon Hartnett did a lot of this. And she looked at their data over the past 10 years and found that over 10% of all of their juvenile arrests were for domestic battery types of incidents. 65% of these resulted in no injury at all, and 34% of these resulted in only minor injuries. So essentially, 99% were either minor or no injury, but these youth were overridden and placed into detention at a much higher rate than any other youth with similar types of crimes. And these youth were returned to court much more often. So it seemed like the system response was just not appropriate or not in line with the actual level of severity of the offense. So they wanted to take a look at this and try and figure out if there was, a better solution. One of the reasons that the system response here was so harsh and typically has been so harsh nationally is because that response is based largely on the adult intimate partner violence model. And the intimate partner violence model generally favors separation of the parties and places sole blame on the perpetrator. And as we know, a number of states have laws now, or I think most, if not all states have laws now, that if there's a domestic dispute and anyone has incurred some time, is that the power and control dynamic between a youth and a caregiver is just different than the power and control dynamic between 2 intimate partners. In intimate partner violence, typically there's motivation, it's motivated by control over the victim. In adolescent domestic battery, there may be a motivation for having control over the environment, but not necessarily over the victim. There's an intent to harm or humiliate often is the case in intimate partner violence, but with adolescent domestic battery, there may be no real intent to harm. Instead, it may be the youth's intent to get their own way. And clearly, there's another difference, and that is the power differential, where typically a parent should be the one who's in the position of authority, whereas with an intimate partner violence situation, you know, these two individuals should be more equal. So the system response for intimate partner violence doesn't work well in the case of adolescent domestic battery. So we thought maybe the system response should be something that's more similar to the way that we manage youth who are charged with any kind of batteries or assault, whether it's on a caregiver or not. But this also isn't a great fit because there are differences between your general garden variety adolescent battery incident and a domestic battery incident. And some of those differences, of course, is that, you know, think about a bullying type of situation. There's generally either no emotional connection at all between the parties, or there's at least no positive emotional connection. In the family setting, there may be a greater degree of ambivalence. For example, I love my mom and I know I shouldn't hit her, but in your typical situation, assault situation, there's generally a pretty easy way to separate the parties. When it comes to adolescent domestic battery, it's much more difficult to separate the parties emotionally and physically when we consider the fact that adolescents are dependent on their parents and their family situation. So it seemed to us that we may need not only a different approach of assessment to try and determine what it is that is going to be the best treatment or system response for the youth, but also to try and get a sense of whether the youth is at risk of continuing to commit adolescent domestic battery. And this may require different kinds of assessment methods, as well as different protocols for how we respond to the situation. So we asked ourselves, you know, what if not all kids who commit domestic battery are the same? And this question is not rocket science, because I think it's already very well known that not all kids who commit any type of offending are all the same. We know that kids commit offending for different reasons. Some are at different levels of risk for continuing in that behavior and so on. And why would domestic battery be any different? Second, we wondered, what if we could determine that different types of kids and families just need different types of responses to help remedy the situation? And third, what if we could address familial risk factors and teach youth and parents or guardians new ways of resolving family conflict? If we're capable of doing that, then is a juvenile justice intervention really the best approach? So this led to the current study, which I'll be talking to you a bit about, our study and our manual. I was the principal investigator of this study, which was designed to develop the adolescent domestic battery typology tool and to validate it, to develop and validate it. However, the masterminds of this approach and this whole idea really were Wendy Nussbaum, Stuart Berry, and Shannon Hartnett, my colleagues from Illinois, who had been dealing with these sorts of issues for a long time. They really came up with the concepts, the idea, the strategies. I was just the one that applied the research methods. This manual is available for download on our website. It's completely free, and most everything I'll be talking about today can be found in that manual, although I will be presenting a little bit of data that's slightly different from what you would find in there. I should also mention that much of what I'll be talking about today is going to also come out in a brief by the Technical Assistance Network at the University of Maryland that should be coming out early next year, and we will also post that on our website, both at Spark and at NICEAP. So I'll walk you through a little bit of the development of this assessment tool and then talk about how it works. And then we'll talk a bit about what might be appropriate system responses or interventions for youth who are charged with adolescent domestic battery. And I should mention, we had to, in order to really hone our research and do a good job here, we had to try and define a homogeneous population. And so our definition of adolescent domestic battery for the purposes of this manual is specific to battery towards a parent or a caregiver or other individual who has an established parental role that's presumed to be stable for the foreseeable future. So we don't know to what extent this assessment would apply to the cases of, to those situations where youth are in a group home kind of setting or a very, very temporary foster setting and maybe committed an act of battery on a authority figure in those settings. We don't know, and there is reason to believe that the reasons behind that type of battery or violent behavior would be somewhat different. So we don't know that this assessment tool would apply to those situations well. It also would not apply well to serious sibling incidents. So that's very specific towards situations where a youth has directed aggression on a caregiver. All right. So we'll talk a bit about the development of the tool. We had a few guiding principles, and these guiding principles are very similar to the work that Models for Change, all of the Models for Change. Battery youth are different than adults who are engaged in partner violence. That was one guiding principle. A second principle was that we assume not all youth who entered the system for adolescent domestic battery were the same, and therefore they shouldn't all get the same response. Adolescent domestic battery also seems to predominantly be a family problem rather than a youth-specific problem. That's another thing that separates this from other types of just general violent behavior, is that this really is a family system issue and not a youth-specific issue. And yet, what our response has been is to remove those youth from the home and treat them like they're a perpetrator. Fourth, the youth's risk of committing adolescent domestic battery, just like a youth's risk of committing general delinquent behavior or other forms of violence, are likely to change over time simply as a result of developmental factors. We know youth's risk changes over time. Sometimes that change can be fairly rapid as youth mature. And so we need, as with any other assessment strategy that we apply to youth, we need for it to be dynamic, and we shouldn't consider the way they look today to be indicative of the way they're going to necessarily look 6 months from now. And in fact, that's true of adults too, but with youth, we expect the change to be a bit more rapid. Another guiding principle was that we suspected many of these youth probably suffered from mental health issues or were entangled in ongoing family cycles of violence, neglect, substance abuse, and criminal involvement. So we thought that development of any kind of assessment strategy might result in identifying different subtypes of youth who had different levels of these types of issues going on in their life. And any kind of research project that was done with these youth charged with these crimes should also measure other things like substance abuse, neglect, and so on. We also thought there were too few alternatives to formal system involvement or secure detention, and we need more alternatives to the way that we respond to these youth. And finally, based on actual risk of harm to others, some of these youth and families do not belong in the delinquency system at all. So these were our guiding principles, some of them being hypotheses more than principles that led to the work that we did here. The goals for this tool, the ADBTT, which stands for the Adolescent Domestic Battery Typologies tool, and frankly, this is a horrible acronym. We were not thinking about putting together a catchy acronym at the time, and if we ever go back and revise the tool, we will definitely come up with something better because ADBTT is a bit of a mouthful. But The goals for this tool were to develop a common language about adolescent domestic battery, to help determine which families or youth are truly at risk of future harm. We wanted to be able to predict which youth were most likely to commit future acts of ADB. We also wanted an assessment tool that would help folks in the juvenile justice system and in other systems, frankly, to match their system responses to use risk and keep youth who don't belong in the system out of the system. And likewise, we also wanted to develop an assessment tool that would help individuals in the field match their treatment response to the type, if there were such a thing as a type or typology for ADB. So those were the goals of the tool. And for those of you who are familiar with our whole risk needs assessment approach in juvenile justice, you'll see some clear similarities here. The idea is to have a tool that is going to give us some information about which youth are at greatest risk for continuing down this path, and which youth probably aren't going to do anything, even if they only have minimal intervention. They probably won't do it again. And we also want to figure out what is the best response depending on the type of youth. The steps of development to this tool, this was a several year, probably a 5-year process by the time I got involved. So the initial description of typologies was designed and put together by Wendy Nussbaum, who is a clinician who's been working with youth charged with adolescent domestic battery for a long time. So she really was the mastermind of this project. We took her typologies that were based on her clinical experience, and we did a small pilot study in Illinois that was based on file review. We used that to kind of refine what the assessment items would look like and to derive, to see if there were actually independent typologies of youth. So that was the pilot study that allowed us to put together a pilot assessment tool. We then received funding from the MacArthur Foundation, more funding from the MacArthur Foundation to do a major multi-site validation study. And this study was done in 5 different court jurisdictions in 4 different states. Every jurisdiction was a slightly different entry point. So for some, the assessment was conducted in detention because the youth had already been put in detention. For some, it was done pre-adjudication in some type of potential diversionary program. For others, it was done post-adjudication. And for even others, it was done with youth who are already on probation. So we wanted to get a really good range of different types of kids charged with ADB, and that was what we did, because we were trying to really have a tool that would generalize fairly well nationally. We also looked at the inter-rater reliability of the items we put together. We conducted factor analysis and looked at correlates of the different subtypes. The subtypes were derived by factor analysis, and then we also followed the arrest records of these youth for a period of time to look at the predictive validity of the typologies. So this was about a 3-year project that went into developing the manual, and all of the research is, a lot of the research is described in the manual. So to the meat of the research findings. This is the largest sample of youth charged with adolescent domestic battery that I've seen in any research study. And it's a very rich data set that gives us a lot of information about what's happening with the youth charged with this crime. I think that's really, that in and of itself is some really important information as we see the number of these arrests rise in our country. So we had close to 400 youth. All of these assessments were done in the field by juvenile justice staff, and the level of training of those staff and the credentials of those staff was slightly different depending on the setting. However, they were all trained, of course, by us on the assessment tool before they did it for this study. The age range of these youth was from 9 to 18. Surprisingly, 41% of these kids charged with adolescent domestic battery were girls. That's a relatively high percentage of girls. Generally, in any juvenile justice sample that I have acquired in my career, only about 20 to 25% of the sample is girls. So we're actually seeing a much higher representation of girls among these people who are charged with adolescent domestic battery. The majority of that, like the fact that we were in a lot of different jurisdictions, some of which you might see a fairly high percentage of Black or other minorities. One of our places was Arizona, where there are a lot of Hispanic youth, and still the majority of youth who were charged with this crime were non-Hispanic white. The mother was the victim. The mother, biological or stepmom or so on, was a victim in the majority of these cases as well. And similar to the stats that I showed you from Illinois initially, the vast majority of these youth who were charged with ADB had either done no injury at all to their victim, no physical injury to their victim, or only minor injuries such as cuts or bruise. So very little injury. The severity of the aggression was minimal. We also found that for this sample of youth, a lot of them had prior system involvement before it had prior involvement with the child welfare system. That's actually a bit smaller than I had expected. 73.5% had this charge, and a good sized majority of these kids had, meaning they had either had counseling in the past or were currently in counseling, or had received a mental health diagnosis of some sort, or had even maybe had some psychiatric hospitalization at some point. This tells us that there are a lot of opportunities for early intervention with these youth because they have touched many systems before they've even gotten to the stage of a formal arrest. And I'm going to talk about that later when we talk about what's an appropriate system response. So these are often multi-system involved youth and families. What we found is that there are 4 subtypes. Most of the kids, I think there were about 10 or less youth in our sample who we just could not seem to fit into any typology. But there are 4 primary types. The smallest percentage is what we've labeled the defensive typology, and that's 13.7% of kids. What this typology represents is that any violence that had been committed by the youth towards the caregiver, not just the current incident, but any violence that the youth had ever committed towards the caregiver, was in response to a physical threat by the parent. So in other words, the youth was defending themselves. And the only incidence of aggression by the youth towards the caregiver was in self-defense. 26.3% of the youth fell into the isolated category. We refer to it as the isolated incident category or typology. And the way that we defined that was that the violence or the aggression was an isolated incident, meaning it actually could have happened once or twice. So it doesn't mean this was just the first incident. There may have been a couple of incidents. And the aggression was really born out of some atypical family stress or stress experienced by the youth. So there was some very stressful situation, and aggression was the way that the youth had responded to it. And without such stress, the youth may have chosen a more appropriate conflict resolution. In these cases, the parents actually, as far as we could tell, were typically using appropriate levels of authority with the youth. There may be appropriate consequences for behavior in the home, appropriate monitoring, and so on. So there didn't seem to be a problematic family dynamic. It's just that the youth dealt with stress in this fashion towards their caregiver. The family chaos group, and we're increasing in severity of the typology as I'm talking. The family chaos group, 17.8%, that defines a pattern of events in which the youth's behavior predictably spirals to the point of battery in order to obtain his or her purposes, and is characterized by inconsistent and unclear parental authority. So in other words, there's not a clear pattern of authority by the parents. They're very inconsistent. And the extent to which they take motivation for the aggression is to sort of get their own way. The escalating group, that was the largest typology, but still not the majority of kids charged with ADB, because this is less than half the kids who are charged with ADB. This group, this is the most severe subtype. And they had a pattern of behavior that was designed to basically intimidate, control, and coerce the parent into giving in to their demands. So this is defined by youth who are really trying to dominate the parent. We looked at the correlates, some of the correlates of these different subtypes. So the factor analysis indicated those were the subtypes of kids charged with ADB. And there are some interesting correlates that go along with that. So in the defensive category, for example, here we saw the parents were the most likely of any of the 4 typologies to have had alcohol or substance use currently or in the past. So there was some kind of alcohol or drug abuse by the caregiver. This group also had, the youth had the lowest rates of prior mental health system involvement or police contact or what have you. So the youth in this category was the least likely to have had other system involvement, but the parents seem to often have drug and alcohol problems. In the isolated group, these youth had the highest rate of prior mental health system exposure. A small majority of them had a previous mental health diagnosis. So it seemed that this was, they didn't have the highest rate of prior mental health system involvement, but they had a relatively high rate of prior mental health system involvement. They also had the lowest rate of childhood maltreatment, and putting that together with a lot of our other data just indicated that this group really, that there was no indication for the majority of these youth that the parents were doing anything, inappropriate. So there wasn't childhood maltreatment. They were maintaining appropriate levels of authority. These just seem to be, like I said, isolated incidents because the youth doesn't know how to cope with stress in any other way, and there may be some mental health issues going on. For the family chaos group, this one, there were really no striking differences in this group in terms of parental mental health problems or substance abuse issues or youth mental health issues, child welfare involvement. These youth didn't seem likely, they weren't any more likely than the other 2 types that I just went over to have engaged in other delinquent offending or harming other people outside of the home. There just wasn't anything really descriptive about this group, aside from the fact that this group had the highest percentage of girls in it. So this group was more likely to be female than male. Aside from that, the types of measures that we took really didn't correlate with this group. The escalating group, on the other hand, was generally comprised of a subset of youth who had just multiple problems, youth and families who had multiple problems. So these youth had the highest rates of victimization in the past. And that includes childhood maltreatment and victimization. They had the highest rates of prior mental health treatment. They had the highest rates of prior police contact. These youth were significantly more likely to have had histories of running away or hurting other people outside of the home, engaging in property damage, and several other aspects of sort of delinquent behavior. These youth were the ones attended. This was clearly kind of a more serious subtype relative to the other three. They looked more serious and looked, however, it was still it was still not the majority of kids who are charged with ADB. So those were the differences between the subtypes and how we would define them. We also looked at the recidivism rates, of course, because that's very important. And we tracked the recidivism, and again, we defined recidivism by a new arrest or petition to the court. Many of these youth were having some form of supervision during the course of the study, so many of them were still involved with the juvenile justice system, either a diversion program or probation or unsupervised probation or something to that effect. So they were being monitored, so we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at their offense rates, their recidivism rates. We tracked recidivism for an average of 10.5 months, which is not a dramatically long period of time for a recidivism study. The range was 5 months, no case was tracked for less than 5 months, and it went up to 15.5 months for an average of 10.5 months. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we looked at their rates of reoffending, and we looked at both charges for new adolescent domestic battery offenses, and then we looked at charges for any type of offenses. So as you can see, those in the escalating and family chaos group had significantly higher rates of recidivism for new adolescent domestic battery charges than the other two groups. The escalating group, 31% of them, about a third of them, committed another domestic battery charge. And in the family chaos group, it was fairly similar. About a third of them did as well. That's compared to the defensive group or the isolated group, both of which less than 20% of those kids committed another or received another adolescent domestic battery charge. And again, we have to remember that they are being monitored. So these, so any concerns in the home, and they're likely to be getting arrested. We also looked at any recidivism. You see the defensive subtype, only a quarter of them were involved in some kind of delinquent activity that they were arrested for. And that includes adolescent domestic battery, by the way. Those rates include that. The escalating type, over 50% of them were engaged in some kind of general delinquent offense. And the family chaos group, a significant percentage of them were as well. Now, we didn't compare these groups. We didn't look at significant differences between these groups based on their rates of reoffending, because there were variable levels or variable lengths of time that these kids had the opportunity to reoffend. So it's not really fair to compare them in terms of rates, since some of these kids would have had more, relatively less time to reoffend. Instead, we looked at whether they had significant differences in the amount of time it took them to commit their first offense. So this was all time dependent. We controlled for time in these analyses. And the escalating and family chaos groups definitely were significantly more likely to reoffend. These were the groups that we were most concerned about, possibly committing another adolescent domestic battery. Another question in the study was, you know, even if we can put together an assessment tool that may predict who's likely to reoffend in a domestic context, who cares if we can do that if the general risk assessment tools that are already used in the juvenile justice system can do the same thing? So we really had to see, is there any value added by using the assessment tool we're creating, instead of just using the regular juvenile justice risk assessment tool. So we compared the predictive accuracy or the predictive validity of the ADBTT to whatever risk assessment tool was being used by that court. All of them were using a risk assessment tool. There was the ARNA, there was the YAZI, there was the OYAS, and then Connecticut was another one of our, two of our sites were in Connecticut, and they used the JAG. So they all had validated assessment tools that they were using already. And what we found is that the ADBTT predicted delinquent offending about as well as any of their risk assessment tools did. But it specifically predicted domestic battery better than those other tools did. So there was a value added because this assessment tool is more specific to features that may go into whether one is likely to commit domestic battery in the future. So it is a more specific assessment, and it does have value added if you have a youth who is charged with a domestic battery to use this tool. The way it's set up is there's 8 domains. The domains are to the left here. Each of these domains has a few questions within them that the assessor would ask. The assessor should be trained, of course, in how to do the assessment. The manual contains a number of example interview questions that could be used. You want to interview both the youth and the parent. And then there's item descriptions within the manual that explains exactly how to rate each of the items in the tool. There's 32 items in the tool falling within these 8 domains. I'm just going to give an example from one domain, just so folks can see how it's sort of set up. One of the domains has to do with parental authority, which is really a big indicator of whether there's going to be domestic battery in the home. And the purpose of this domain is to determine the characteristics of the existing level of parental authority between the youth and the parent. Sort of like trying to find out who wears the pants in the family, who's making the decisions, and what happens when expectations are not met. And clearly you want to look for patterns here, not just what happened within the specific incident that the youth was charged with. So that's the purpose of this domain. There's 4 items where you're considering whether the youth would be rated in this item or not. It's basically a yes or a no. So the defensive version of the defensive item within the parental authority domain would be checked if the parent demonstrates developmentally unreasonable level of authority. So the parent basically is authoritarian. It's lopsided. The parent is in control, reasonable level of control, and makes all of the decisions and ignores the input of other people. In the isolated incident category, the parent demonstrates a developmentally reasonable level of authority. We would consider this more authoritative, which is kind of the parenting strategy that we're all striving for. Parent has a final say about decisions affecting the family, but allows the youth to have input and encourages autonomy. In the family chaos condition, or the item that relates to the family chaos group, this item would be checked if parental authority is inconsistent or unclear. So basically, it's inconsistent or non-existent. At times, the parent tends to be in control. At other times, the youth is in control, and sometimes no one is in control. There's unclear or low standard abuse behavior in the home. There's sporadic or inconsistent attempts at discipline or enforcing limits. And these things can frequently result in domain. It would be checked if the youth would be checked more often for the youth in the escalating category. So that is parental authority is shifting or has shifted to youth. So this item would be checked if parental authority has basically been entirely usurped by the youth. They exhibit a range of behaviors and attitudes designed to create a non-developmental and ultimately permanent shift in control from the parent to the youth. So one is going through each of these definitions and asking themselves, does this family dynamic fit more with this item, or does it fit with the defensive item, or the isolated, or the family chaos item? So only one of these will be checked, because youth can really only, the family dynamic can really only be one. It can't be more than one of these. There's also a severity scale at the end of each domain, ranging from 0 to 4, where you're indicating the level of severity within this domain. And that final severity score also is predictive of who's likely to continue engaging in domestic battery. So that's how the tool works. It results in, once the full assessment is done, there's a scoring procedure that the examiner can use, or the person who's conducted the assessment could use, to determine which subtype the youth and family fits into the best. From there, the goal is to then determine what's the best response. And I'm going to get into the responses in a second, because that has to do with, that really is a part of implementing the assessment tool. So when you're thinking about implementing the assessment, if there is seems to be a pattern of aggression in the home, and they want to do an assessment, or community mental health settings, we think it would be very appropriate there too. The examiner does not need a high level, the assessor does not need a high level of credentials to do this. They just need to have some familiarity with working with youth, interviewing skills, and special training on the tool, which takes a couple of days and then some practice cases in the field. So as with any assessment tool, there are implementation considerations, and the tool's use will only go as far and will only be as good as the implementation allows it to be. So we know no assessment tool is going to change a system. What's going to change the system is the thoughtfulness with which it's been implemented. Consider that's not terribly different from implementing other types of assessment tools, like a risk assessment tool, is where should it be implemented and how will it be used? What are the legal considerations? So with respect to information sharing, what kinds of questions are allowed to be asked, and so on. What are the resources needed and the costs? Who should conduct the assessment? Who should be assessed? So you define the eligibility criteria for the assessment, basically who's eligible to get this assessment. It's not the kind of assessment that you do with every youth coming into the juvenile justice system. It's the kind of assessment you would do with youth who have been charged with a domestic battery offense. There should also be a process for data collection and evaluation of the whole process. The goal is to have an assessment to response continuum. So you start with the assessment, ideally paired with a mental health screen, because as we've seen, many of these kids have had mental health involvement, mental health system involvement, and may have some mental health issues. So mental health screening is also going to be very important. That should hopefully lead to, the assessment then should lead to a safety plan and a safety screen, and then a safety plan. Once those are done, you would also select the best system response and then the best treatment response. We see those as two different things. So it's a 4-step process. This would be the ideal implementation procedure, is to implement these the whole continuum. So 3 important steps after conducting the assessment: a safety screen. So it's to put a safety screen in place. So that's an immediate screening of the fact, not an assessment, it's something brief that's basically to just determine, is this a safe situation, or will someone need to be removed from the home for a time being. A safety plan can also be very effective to make sure that the family, the youth and the family stays safe, because there is generally an effort to reunify the youth with his or her family in the safest way possible. Safety plan can be typically an example safety plan that they use in Illinois would be to have the youth or parent both list people they can talk to when they get stressed out, both list activities that they can use to help calm them down when they are upset, and then walk through with them and develop a list of areas of concern. So if A happens, what can you do to help cope with that situation better than having it result in some kind of aggressive situation? Lastly is the case planning part, and that is, are you making recommendations for formal versus informal processing? And some of that will be based on the results of the assessment tool, obviously, and the safety screen. Like, are they going to be safe going back home together? And referral and treatment planning. So what follow-up services would you recommend for the youth and the family? The manual has got a matrix of system responses to consider based on the subtype that the youth falls into. And it will state which type of system response is probably not appropriate given the typology. So for example, mediation is probably not going to be sufficient for the defensive group. That youth is probably unsafe and they need something a little more serious than that. They may need some child welfare involvement, DCFS kind of investigation. So that's just an example. The treatment response matrix is also included in the manual, and it's split up between specific type of treatment. I have given you an example here of the matrix that's included in the manual for ADB specific treatments. Step Up is one that is a very intensive type of treatment that could be highly recommended for that family chaos or escalating type of group where you're really looking for a more intensive form of intervention. So the manual's got some good suggestions about that. So in sum, I do want to highlight the fact that use of an assessment, I think I have explained the fact that use of an assessment specific to ADB could be helpful and add value to the justice system if you've got youth who are being charged with that type of offense. Because this can tailor both the assessment and the system and help tailor the system and treatment response to these kids. The majority of them are not, your typical delinquent or your typical youth who's going to be violent in other types of contexts. A very good percentage of these kids are unlikely to engage in this behavior again, and may just need some mediation for the whole family or mental health treatment or so on. We talk in the brief that will be coming out at the beginning of the year about the need for a system of care approach, and that is really trying to work together across child system providers to have a common language and talk about these typologies, align the language together and work together to develop the best kind of treatment response matrix. Because a lot of these youth, as I mentioned, will be involved with child welfare or with a mental health system. So it's better to work together rather than to be siloed in the way that we're trying to intervene. So I'm going to end there, and we have 5 minutes for questions. So I'll turn it back over to you, Dee.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Vincent. That was very informative, and we'll be on the lookout for your brief later this early next year. We have a couple questions. The first is, for the escalating group, were there questions about the type of previous maltreatment, neglect, or type of abuse? I wonder how the impact of undisclosed or untreated sexual abuse plays into this, especially for girls.
Okay, so that is a good question. I am going to have to look at our data here just a second to answer that question because it's not right in the back of my head. So the way that we measured child maltreatment was to use the JVQ, which is essentially a inventory. For those who aren't familiar with it, it stands for Juvenile Victimization Questionnaire, and it's essentially an inventory of traumatic events, trauma-related events they may have had in the past. There is a sexual victimization scale. Had the highest scores. Not the family chaos group, which is where we had, which was more girls than boys. But I should mention that the escalating group was still the most common group for both girls and boys. Even though there were more girls in the family chaos group than boys, overall, the most common subtype for both girls and boys was escalating. So yes, sexual victimization may be related and certainly would be an area to assess.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Another question is asking about the domains of parental concern. To what extent is there an opportunity to ascertain the youth's concerns? For example, if the youth has concern for his or her own safety in the home.
Yes, good question. So one of the domains, that's right. One of the domains has to do with the parent's concern, and you're right. There's less about the youth's concern, except we're getting a little bit of the youth's concern when we talk about when we're looking at their attitude towards violence or their attitudes towards change, especially in the youth attitude toward change domain, where you would be asking them questions about what it is that they're concerned about. Do they think that their behavior was, you know, the best way to have handled the situation, and so on. For youth in the defensive category, there are questions that we'll get at whether they did that in self-defense and they're afraid of their safety. But another way also, I mean, aside from the youth, from getting that information from the youth when you're doing the assessment, the safety planning after the assessment is incredibly important for finding that out. Because clearly if the youth is afraid for their safety, you don't want to put them back in that home. That's a really important question.
Okay, I think we have time for this one last question. How long does the assessment take to administer? Someone was wondering.
That's a good question. And we did not time them and we should have, but it's 32 items falling within 8 domains, and it's based on an interview with the youth alone and then the parent alone, and then a bit of time with both of them together. I think the interview on average was taking people about, that interview process, I think was taking people about 30 minutes. And there may be a little bit of collateral information review, as with any assessment. So these assessments, by and large, would not take as long as a comprehensive risk assessment would, because you're only hitting a few areas. I would estimate about half an hour. But to be honest, we haven't timed it. The research study to develop this tool used a much longer version than the final version was. So in this final version, I'm really not sure, but I would estimate 30 to 40 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vincent. We appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for joining us. If you had any questions that you didn't feel you wanted to type in, you can email them to me. I'm Deirdre Logan. My email address was on all of the invitations you would have received from GoToWebinar, and I can forward anything on to Dr. Vincent. Be on the lookout for future announcements about upcoming Spark and Transitions RTC webinars. We'll have a whole slew of them coming out in the spring and winter. So thank you very much, and happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you, Dee, and happy holidays.